your costly love, your pursuit of us. And so we give you thanks and praise and ask that you might speak to us. And we ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen. Understanding, if we're to understand things, it's important to understand the relationship of the parts to the whole. You're going to break something down, you want to learn how something functions. It's also important that you learn how it functions in terms of the whole entity, the whole thing. And so we have the adage, sometimes people can't see the forest for the trees. If we focus too much on the parts, we miss the big picture. And I think that's true about our lives. I mean, we live storied lives. All of our lives are stories. And we have stories that are connected and embedded or nested in other stories. And so to be more fully known, the more we know of those stories, how the smaller stories fit into the larger stories and intersect with other stories, the more we understand, the more of a complete picture we have of the person. I know there have been a number of times in my life, more frequently than I would like to admit, I'll meet somebody and, I don't know, I'll find them off-putting or something that doesn't set right with me. I don't know much about them, but then I find out a fuller part of the story. I'll find some backstory, and it will totally change my perspective on that person. It's amazing. When I have a more complete picture of that person, sometimes it can radically change how I experience and how I understand that person. And other times, with other people, sometimes the more you understand the background, just the richer it becomes, the more you appreciate who they are and what they've done. So the stories, these embedded stories we have, these nested stories, I think are really, really important. And I think that's the way history works as well. And as we enter Holy Week this week, I think it's important that we understand how Palm Sunday fits into the larger stories. How Palm Sunday fits into the larger stories. My guess is many folks have snippets. There's a story here, there's a story here, there's a story here. Frequently, the stories aren't really connected. There's not a sense. Folks don't understand how this story is nested in this story, how it's connected with this story, and how these stories are all nested in the larger story. And so it becomes difficult to understand. And so Palm Sunday is a fun Sunday. It starts out Holy Week. The kids come in waving palm fronds. There's kind of excitement. We sing upbeat music. But we need to understand how this story, how the story of Palm Sunday, of Jesus entering in Jerusalem, connects with the larger stories that are going on. And so I propose to do that in a small way this morning. I'm hoping to show how this story is nested with some other very important stories without which we don't understand the full picture. So if we were to do just an outline of the story of Palm Sunday, we know Jesus and his disciples are hit Bethphage, and they've been walking all the time. Jesus asks a couple of the disciples to go get a donkey. They do that. They retrieve a donkey for him. He gets on the donkey. He goes up to Jerusalem. And this is the time of year, Passover, when Jerusalem fills with pilgrims. So as he goes into Jerusalem, there are some folks that seem very excited as he go in there. They put they put branches down palm. They put garments down as he enters Jerusalem. And then we also have a little snippet of Psalm 118, verses 25, 26. Hosanna in the highest. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord, which has kind of an interesting ring to it. So that's the bare bones story that we celebrate on Palm Sunday. So now let's go back and put a little bit more flesh on that story. So we know that Israel is been conquered by the Romans. Israelites hate the Romans. Bottom line, they just hate the Romans. There's not much good feeling about them. So we need to know that context. We know sociologically speaking, there wasn't a very big middle class. It's mostly the rich people and the poor people, and the vast majority of the people were poor. The vast majority of the people were oppressed. They had heavy tax burdens. And most of the people couldn't stand those Jews that were working with the Romans. So that's kind of the social context we're talking about. And so then we get the donkey. Now, it's always hard. We always talk about Jesus riding on a donkey. As a horseback rider, I think donkeys look ridiculous, I have to tell you. And I think most of us, if we see someone on a donkey, it's kind of comical. I mean, who rides donkeys, right? I mean, maybe a clown would ride a donkey in our culture. I don't ever see anyone riding a donkey, nor do I see anyone that really wants to ride a donkey. So that's a kind of a little bit of a cultural thing we need to understand, because in the days of Jesus in Israel and before, hundreds of years before, donkeys were royal transport. Okay, kings and royalty would ride on donkeys. For example, when Solomon, who was David's son, was going to his coronation, he rode on a donkey. All of David's sons rode on donkeys. So that's kind of a cultural shift we have to kind of make, because it was in Israel, if you rode on a donkey, it was a sign of royalty. It was, the king would ride on the donkey. So that's a bit of information we need to understand as well. And in addition to that, as he's riding up, so people are putting garments and they're putting branches down. One of the gospel writers says put palm branches down. But again, when there was royalty coming, if you were to put your garment down, or you put the branches, but especially if you put your garment down, that would be equivalent to the red carpet treatment in our day and age. And so to put your garment down for the king or the person to walk over would be a way of really prostrating yourself, showing humility and obeisance to the person that's going up the hill. And then again, they're reciting from Psalm 118, and it's kind of got this flavor of the Messiah. Now, we have to understand that the Jews were looking for a Messiah. They wanted someone to save them from and to overthrow the Romans. There wasn't one picture of what that Messiah would be like. There were a lot of different ideas. There wasn't one focused view. There was a lot of kind of cloudy ideas of what the Messiah would do. There could be more of a priestly side to him. There could be more of the conquering hero side to him. And so, but the people are longing to have someone throw off the rule of the Romans. And this has been just percolating and percolating for decades and decades since the Romans took over and took their freedom away. So all of this is kind of going on. And so as Jesus then goes up to Jerusalem and people are doing this, it feels like there's the hope. They don't know exactly, but there's kind of this sense that maybe we have someone here who is finally going to take us to the place that we want to be. We finally have the leader who will lead us and throw off the Roman overrulers, and that we will then be free and we will be the people that God calls us to be. So there's that kind of thing going on as well. Then when you think, I'm just skipping a little ahead to the end of Holy Week, like Good Friday, sometimes doesn't it seem kind of weird that they're throwing their garments down, they're putting branches down, and less than a week later, they're saying, crucify him? It just seems kind of weird, doesn't it? It seems weird unless you think of opinion polls that we take regularly in our country, right? I mean, it's amazing how an opinion poll can change, right? I mean, the president or somebody does something they really like, the ratings go up, Then that week, the president or some other leader, they do something they don't like, and the opinion polls plunge. My point in this is that, and Jesus knew this, people are fickle. We are fickle. We tend to be fickle. Crowds are fickle. And so as Jesus is going up there, it'd be interesting to know what was going on his mind. But in another place in the Gospels, it says that he wasn't trusting himself to people because he knew, basically, this is a gross paraphrase, he knew how fickle people are. He wasn't going to entrust himself to people's opinions of him. But then there is a larger story into which this is nested. And that story begins with the gospel reading that Mark read just before we read the Palm Sunday story. And that comes in Matthew 20. And this is in verse 17 through 19. It goes, "When Jesus was going up to Jerusalem, he took the 12 disciples aside by themselves and said to them on the way, 'See, we are going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and the scribes, and they will condemn him to death. Then they will hand him over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and on the third day he will be raised.'" So there's still, even before he goes to Bethany, he's heading towards Jerusalem, and this is before they hit Bethphage. And this is the third time in the Gospels he's telling the disciples, look, going up to Jerusalem, but this is what they're going to do to me. It's not going to be a pleasant ending, basically. And this is the third time we have in the Gospel stories that Jesus is telling them what is going to happen, and they don't get it, just like we wouldn't have gotten it either. And so it's very important that we understand that this triumphal entry is part of the larger story of Jesus walking to the cross. He knows that the cross, the shame and the brutality and the violence and everything associated with that, lies at the end of the road. He knows this. Now, I suspect the disciples, when all of this is taking place, on Palm Sunday, I imagine they're pretty excited and they're thinking, hey, maybe something is going to happen. Maybe he will really, he'll throw the Roman overlords off. Maybe things really will happen the way we hope that they happen. But Jesus was trying to let them know, to be forewarned is to be forearmed. He's saying, okay, we're going up here. It doesn't matter what people's opinions are. It doesn't matter how they treat me. This is where we're going. This is going to be the end of the road for me. And so I often wonder, I mentioned earlier, I wonder what it was like to be Jesus. I wonder what it would be like to know that in the midst of all this fanfare, everything that's been going on, that the cross lies at the end of the road. I wonder how would he stay focused? I don't know. I wonder what was going on in Jesus' mind, because if I have something I really don't want to do, and if it's a couple years off, I can kind of shove it out of my mind. You just kind of go through the motions. But when it's coming up, and it's coming up, I just wonder what that was like for Jesus to have to know that he was going to face that kind of a situation. But we are told, there was one pastor who said, if you want to know what's on the mind of Jesus, read the Old Testament. Jesus was filled with the Scriptures, which for him was the Old Testament. There wasn't a New Testament then. He knew them backwards and forwards. He had many of them memorized. He'd spend hours thinking about them, meditating on them. He knew the Scriptures forward and backward. And he knew the story in the Scriptures in Zechariah, chapter 9, verses 9 and 10. Matthew paraphrases it, and he quotes it in verse 5. He says, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey, on a colt, and a foal on a donkey." Now, when I was younger, I used to think that all this happened and then that Jesus didn't know about any of this, and then the disciples discovered it. I said, oh, that's a fulfillment of prophecy. Look, Jesus got these donkeys, and he didn't know anything about these Scriptures. He was just kind of doing this. Well, that was totally not the way it was. Jesus knew about these, and as he continued to understand who he was in his role, he was making a statement. As one scholar said, he was enacting, this is an enacted symbolic gesture. Jesus was making a statement, not with words, but symbolically, because he knew this text in Zechariah 9 and 9 and 10, and he was applying it to himself. He walked everywhere. He never, as far as we know, he never rode on a donkey. Everywhere he went, he walked with his disciples. They walked all through Israel. And so when he got to Bethany and Bethphage, he stopped, and he was doing this because he knew the text in Zechariah. And so he was making a symbolic statement to people about who he was. And so that's then when he sent the disciples to get the donkey, and then he rides into Jerusalem on this donkey. And again, it had to be confusing for people because he didn't fit into anybody's image of what a prophet should be, of what a Messiah should be. I mean, he just didn't fit the mold. He didn't fit anybody's mold. Now, the poor really liked him because he really could identify with them on the one hand, but on the other hand, he would eat with the rulers and he'd eat with the Pharisees. I mean, he didn't limit who he ate with, who he had table fellowship with. So he probably offended everybody at one time or another. He just didn't fit in the mold. So that's why, as he goes up to Jerusalem on the donkey, there was, I'm sure, a lot of confusion. There was a lot of hope. There was some expectation. But people really didn't know. They didn't understand what was going on exactly. They had a lot of hopes, and they were imagining that he would fulfill their hopes, but they didn't know for sure. They didn't know what was going on. But he was making a statement, a symbolic statement about who he is. Yes, he is indeed the Lord's anointed, and he is going to bring righteousness, and he is going to the cross. People didn't understand exactly about that at all. But it's important we understand that this story is embedded in that story. But that story, and there are other stories I'm skipping over, but that story is embedded in the story of God's covenant faithfulness with Israel. God has chosen Israel to be his people so that they would be an example to all the nations of the world of what this God they worship was like. This God who had a passion for justice and righteousness. And so they were to be the embodied being, so to speak, of this covenant, so that they would be an example, so nations would look at them and say, wow, this is what God is really like. And they would turn to God and worship God. And yet Israel was unfaithful in their calling. They would constantly stir away. God was always going after Israel. Israel was always breaking God's heart. God would call them to themselves. They'd follow him for a while, and then they'd just go their own way. And God would always be reaching out, be hurt and angry, and at the same time always showing mercy. So God finally decided to send Jesus, who would be Israel embodied in him, and he would fulfill the Torah, and he would make all things right. He would bring justice, and he would bring righteousness, and he would do what we could not do for ourselves. He would save us. And then that story fits even into the larger story of the creation, that God made this creation. He made the world good. He made us to be rich in relationship with God, with others, with ourselves, and with the creation. And so sin entered the world, our own rebellious hearts, and so that has wrecked everything. And that's the grandest story, that God has never given up on the world that he created, that he loves, that he continues to love, who he's never forgotten, who is always engaged with the world. And this is the God who has come to die on the cross so that we might have life and have it abundantly. Now I want to encourage you for this Holy Week to read one of the read the Passion in Gospel stories. The Passion is the theological term for Jesus going to the cross. And so I'd like to encourage everyone this week. It's a great time so you get a fuller understanding. A lot of times we just jump from Palm Sunday. Some of you will come to Maundy, Thursday. Some will come to Good Friday, but most of you won't. And so we go from Palm Sunday to Easter. And if you do that, you kind of miss. It's very easy to miss the big picture. So I would encourage you to go to those services if you can. But if you can't, choose one of the Gospels and read from Palm Sunday to the end so that you get a fuller sense of the story. So if you turn to Matthew, go from Matthew 21 to the end. That goes to Matthew 28. It's about a chapter a day. If you read if you read Mark, that would be Mark chapter 11, and that goes through 16. If you want to go through Luke, that would be Luke chapter 19, starting in verse 41 to the end of the book. Or if you choose John, it would be John chapter 12, verse 20, and then you go through the end of the book. But I would encourage you in this Holy Week to really immerse yourself in the story that the liturgical year invites us to enter, so that we might more fully embrace it. It won't be just a few abstract thoughts, but it can be kind of absorbed into us, and we can rejoice and follow this God whose love has been so costly, whose love is so full, and who stopped at nothing so that we might have life and have it more abundantly. And so let us follow Jesus with the disciples as he walks toward the cross this week. Amen.